Welcome to the Game Changer podcast. In this show, we explore the strategies, stories, and science that drives success in the most demanding arenas. My name is Roberto Chiodelli, and today we are thrilled to have Dr. Brent Hogarth, a clinical psychologist and executive coach specialized in high performance psychology. Please, doctor, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm going to present you here, but let's see if the data I have here is correct. So Dr. Hogarth has a master's in sports psychology and a doctorate in clinical psychology from John F. Kennedy University. His research on flow states and emotional regulation has been focused on understanding how athletes and professionals can achieve peak performance while mitigating risks like burnout. Dr. Hogarth has worked with Olympic athletes, corporate executives, and members of the military, helping them harness the power of flow. He also collaborates with the Finding Mastery podcast and conducts private clinical work, particularly with individuals with ADHD. His approach employs techniques from acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, and emphasizes self-compassion and mindfulness. An avid athlete himself, Dr. Hogarth has completed a full Ironman and a 100-mile ultramarathon, bringing a wealth of practical experience to his coaching. Welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to receive you here, Dr. Brent Hogarth.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. And, right off the bat, I think, for people to understand me a little bit more, I grew up as a provincial gymnast, so high-level male gymnast in Canada, representing British Columbia. But I was also a completely out of control youth. I was
Okay.
in and out of court. I was, eventually sent to a military school. And it was after military school when I finally did well academically, I ended up going to India and living in a Buddhist monastery that really first introduced me to really the power of mindfulness and meditation training. I share that just because you shared a bunch of academic things. So just to
Yeah.
really know me, I was an out of control youth, a graffiti artist, a high performing athlete, and learning how to find flow was always my passion and what drove me. But it was really important for me, and I struggled with how to find flow in what was most aligned with my values, what would really help me flourish. And that's really ultimately, Roberto, what my life and my work with clients is about understanding who they are at their best, and then just building tiny habits to help them feel aligned with that. And obviously, as you know, mindfulness is really the golden thread that allows us to continuously enact those tiny habits. So a little bit more about me, and proud to say I'm from Vancouver, Canada, and super excited to connect with your audience in Brazil and Portugal and all around the world. So thank you so much for having me here, and I hope this is of massive value to everyone listening.
Oh, that's awesome, Dr. Brandt. And it was good you brought this up. That was the first question I was going to make. I wanted to know, okay, I want to know about your path, about your early influences, how your life led you to pursue such career. So I'd like to know a little bit more about this. Yeah, as you mentioned, you had you were hyperactive. I don't know if you have ADHD. So could you tell us a little bit more about this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was actually diagnosed with ADHD just
Okay.
last year. So I'm 36 years old and I'm a clinical psychologist, and I've studied diagnosis. That's what I do at psychological assessments. And yet, even myself, for whatever cultural reasons, the way I was brought up in my family, ADHD was something that was always just said, go let Brent play sports. And it's true. I thrived in sports, and that hyperactivity and impulsivity allowed me to be amazing in basketball and rugby and skiing especially. But in other contexts, wasn't so functional and helpful. So yes, certainly have ADHD, was undiagnosed as a child, was never treated. I was just put into sports. And then really, again, I have two older brothers. Both my parents are entrepreneurs, so I had a lot of freedom. two brothers, and that ended up being a lot of fighting at the household, a lot of roughhousing. And to be totally honest, I was charged with assault when I was 16, 2 times.
Wow.
And that led me, yeah, again, in and out of court. And so I clearly had a big chip on my shoulder. I clearly struggled with anger. And it was those moments where I remembered looking at myself in the mirror as a teenager and just asking why am I doing this? Why am I acting this way? And to be totally open here, Roberto, it wasn't until I was in the monastery in Dharamsala, India. It's a place called Tushita Meditation Center. I recommend people looking at it if they want to do a meditation retreat. And I remember there was a moment in meditation where I realized that part of myself that I was trying to find acceptance of, that I was trying to forgive, was really just a thought. It was a story, it was a narrative that kept coming and going in my awareness. And once I realized that that part of myself I was trying to accept was really just a thought, that kind of journey of acceptance was over, because I was trying to accept something that was not real. I was trying to accept me, my ego, and this story as who I am. Where in meditation, we learn to connect with a deeper part of ourselves. We learn to connect with awareness as our true essence. And from that moment, it freed me up to live my life completely different. I didn't have to follow the old rules or roles that my ego was telling me, society was telling me. I got to choose my own values. I get to live more flexibly. And that really is what led me into the path of psychology, because the nun simply kept saying, Buddha is just a cognitive behavioral therapist. He's simply saying, you are in control of your thoughts. You are the boss.
Oh, amazing. Brent, could you please repeat this last part? There was a little break here.
Yep.
So Buddha, yes, it's a little unstable. I don't know, because the internet is supposed to be amazing. You said that Buddha is a cognitive therapist, and there was a little pause there.
Yeah. So my nun in the Buddhist monastery kept saying that Buddha was simply a cognitive behavioral therapist. He's simply saying that you are in control of your thoughts. You are the boss.
Yeah. This is so amazing. And if you study about Buddha, he's very factual. He doesn't say something like believe this. No, he say try this, experience it. But yeah, that's such a great
Let's go
please.
into that a little bit. Let's go into
Yes, please. Sure,
so
go on.
yeah, because as a psychologist, you're a psychologist as well.
Yeah.
We learn about the potential of the mind in psychology. It is very different than the potential of the mind that Buddha shared, right? So Buddha suggests that the mind has the potential for enlightenment, for the ridding of negative thoughts and the fulfilling of positive thoughts. And that aspirational view of our potential got me really excited about psychology and potential. I'm curious on your thoughts on that. The potential of the
that's a great question. And well, we all have stories on why we chose this path. For me, I'm going to be really brief, because I had these psychosomatic symptoms when I was around 17 and 18 years old, where my body felt numb. And eventually I got in touch with a physiotherapist, and I found out that my dorsal, how can I say, nervous system was too contracted. So my body was speaking and I couldn't feel. So he did some breathing and posture exercises, and I got in touch. And kind of 2 tons of the weight left my body. I started feeling again. And then as I
Wow.
started working with him, and I noticed that I was just simply following the flow. I was studying law in Brazil, back in Brazil, but it was as if I was in school, you know, I was following the flow, and okay, I have to find, well, my body spoke. So having this introduction. So then I started to explore. It called my attention that my body was speaking. You know, it was not conscious. I was not aware of that. I was too young. I was not really aware, but my body was not happy with that. So I started, you know, to have different experiences in life. So I also lived abroad and everything. And I ended up finding a group in Brazil that works with Osho, which is a very controversial master. But you know, you could talk a lot about it. But I learned a lot from him as well, for
Let
sure.
me guess. Let me guess. You started doing some dancing movement meditations.
Yeah, yeah. So that
Okay.
was the first. That was my first contact with meditation. It was not like static. It was dancing. It was
Mhm.
also some meditations were cathartic, and so it was crazy for me, you know. And lots of nice people and beautiful people all together and dancing. Oh, this is awesome. And but so Osho has this idea of enlightenment too. He brings, and he talks a lot about Buddha and everything. So I think this aspiration is very important. Yes, of looking for a higher self. You know, not only fitting in society, not only not feeling ill, but looking for a higher potential, as you were saying. You know, so from this on, I started to study Buddhism and then mindfulness and so on. But bioenergetics therapy, I don't know if you've heard, probably you've heard about it. So that's my uh, my view of
Yeah.
it, you know. So uh, this is such a tricky question because some people. So what is enlightenment? You know, enlightenment. Some I don't know. For me, enlightenment is being present and being in finding um, peace of mind during your day. You know, in this crazy world. But sometimes this goal of enlightenment seems like an unreachable, and there are many cults, let's say, that use this as allow. Oh, you are not there yet, you know. So I think
Yeah.
that sometimes this might be very tricky, a very tricky idea, but I really like Buddhism, and it makes me sense.
Yeah, I so appreciate that you brought that up, because, I'm sure you're probably familiar, especially with your background in pain and in the body and acceptance, commitment therapy, and in ACT, we talk a lot about the destructive normality of the brain, how it's very natural for the brain to have negative thoughts, right? To have judgment, to have anxiety, to have, and all of this is not an indication that the brain is broken, but really the work is, we know in mindfulness, is simply change our relationship to those distressing thoughts or that pain, essentially get out of our head and get into our life. And the one thing with the aspirational piece about what Buddha said of the potential of the mind is that, yes, it's inspiring, yes, it promotes motivation and excitement, it also indicates a very clear path. The clear path is that the way that we're thinking now is simply a habit of how we've previously been thinking. And that to do the training now, to catch that anxiety or that fear or that doubt very early, when it's very small, and learn to change your relationship to it, open up to it, be accepting of it, allows us to live more fully. And even more so, what I love, my favorite teaching of Buddhism is his teaching called Transforming Suffering into the Path of Enlightenment. It's such a beautiful teaching, and it's really, two things. One, letting go of the attitude that we should not suffer.
Mhm.
Big, Big thought, big idea. Imagine if we
Yeah.
just did that, how much all of our lives would change. So one, let go of the attitude that we should not suffer. So for everyone listening, that it could be a hard practice you have to go to in your sport. That could be a big loss after a championship game. That could be a sacrifice you've had to make in your past. So letting go of the attitude that should not happen, right? To accept that that is part of life, right? Life is suffering in some ways. And the
Yeah.
second step, and again, very big idea, hard to do, is to learn to find joy in that suffering. I like to say at least meaning, like how can we
Mm.
cultivate meaning or joy in the suffering itself? And what the teaching says is to start with really small things. You stub your toe on your way to practice, you get a parking ticket, something small happens. Use those tiny things so that you can train your mind. So when the big losses and challenges in life show up, we've trained and prepared the mind to be able to be present, as you said,
Yeah.
enlightened in those moments. So, sorry, I'm very excited to talk about my Buddhism. So I hope that's a helpful story.
That's awesome. I'm changing the script, but I think this is amazing. It seems that it's flowing, and which is a point that you have to talk about, state of flow. But before that, you mentioned this. I think that this idea of being aware that suffering is going to happen and it's part of life uh, is if you think about the our modern day, so what's going on right now, we have so many possibility of finding distractions and finding um, anesthetics, right, and not feel the suffering. So it goes against our days, right? So people are always looking, we're always looking to our cell phones and looking for distractions. I don't want to face this because I have more than 1,000 possibilities of doing something else and not look at this, and this is so hard. And I think so nowadays it's much harder than it was at the Buddha times, let's say. What do you think about it? How do you see it?
Yeah. So what we're talking about here is really avoidance, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And we know that, across any mental health challenge, anxiety, depression, even serious clinical diagnosis like schizophrenia, that what's called experiential avoidance. So not
Mhm.
wanting to experience the discomfort or the pain is a characteristic that is what causes or at least significantly contributes to our suffering. And so you're totally right. Our tendency to avoid things, to have a drink of alcohol, to distract ourselves with TV, what it does, why it's so painful, is that it negatively reinforces more avoidance, right? You avoid having that conversation with your coach, so
Yeah.
you feel calm, you feel relaxed. So you learn, okay, let me keep avoiding, let me keep avoiding. But then when you have to have that conversation, now it's even scarier. There's a few metaphors I like to use from acceptance commitment therapy. We could talk about this being like the struggle switch, like a light switch, right?
Mhm.
So this fear, let's say, comes up, and we turn on the struggle switch. And when we struggle with this fear, now it's not just fear. Now we develop these additional emotions. So now maybe it's anxiety about our fear, or sadness. Why is this fear still here? And maybe we judge that. And now maybe it's guilt or shame. Oh, I've been struggling my whole life with this.
Mhm.
Why is this continuing to happen? So what happens when we struggle and turn on that switch, it's as if we get more meshed, more into our head and out of our life. Where the opposite approach is, yes, don't turn on the struggle switch, but I like the metaphor of quicksand. It's like,
Mhm.
quicksand, when you're in the thought, in the struggle, we don't want to, struggle and get sunk more and more. What we do, how we actually get out of quicksand, is we open ourselves up to it. We spread our body up over it, and we allow ourselves to kind of swim through the chaos, through
Mhm.
the suffering, or the pain, I should say. And so you're totally right. Our tendency to avoid
Mhm.
works. And the last thing I'll share is that it's totally natural. because we learn as a young child, if you put your hand on a hot oven, you got to move your hand off. So we learn that avoidance works really, really well. And I'll just add one more thing, Roberto, because I think
Yeah.
this gets another important layer. We can think about avoidance also as wanting to have complete control. And when it comes to finding freedom in the external world, let's use the example of you have a flat tire in your car.
Mhm.
When you have a flat tire in your car, you have rules to follow. You have control. You get the flat tire off, you put the new flat tire on, you follow all these rules. You're back on the road, you're back having freedom in your external world. But when we try to apply that same approach to our inner life, where we try to apply rules, roles, and have control of our emotions, it becomes the problem, not the solution to freedom. So that's where, again, the path to freedom externally is much different than internally. And that's, as you said, is because of avoidance and wanting to have more
Mhm.
control that gets us stuck oftentimes. Does that
Yeah.
make sense? What comes up for you as I share that?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I was thinking that, you work with acceptance and commitment therapy. So it's in the name of the approach, and this is such an important concept, acceptance, right? And people still to these days have lots of problems of dealing with emotions. I mean, we didn't have classes about dealing with our emotions and thoughts, and this concept of acceptance is still really difficult for most people, I would say, or for many people. um
Yeah, and let me just
yeah,
add one thing on that. So when we talk about acceptance commitment
yeah.
therapy, the real gem that we're developing, called ACT for short, acceptance commitment therapy, is what's known as psychological flexibility. So
Mhm.
psychological flexibility is the capacity to allow that stress, that fear, that anxiety, whatever it might be, to show up, right? So to have acceptance of it, and then to redirect our attention on what are my values now I can move towards, even though this fear is showing up. And so that's where, I think sometimes when we talk about acceptance, someone might not just want to accept things just to accept things. But if they're accepting, knowing that it frees them up to get out of their head and into their life, to move towards that hard practice, having that important conversation, stepping up, in their team or in their occupation, that's where the utility of acceptance really comes in, is developing psychological flexibility.
Exactly. Yes. So many people tend to confuse acceptance with giving in, or being it doesn't have, it's just to accept what is there, what I'm feeling, what I'm thinking, what has happened, you know. Um, yeah, I think this is such an important concept, and it makes a lot of difference also. And if you think in psychology, there even in cognitive therapy, I guess, in the earlier approaches would use techniques to deny some emotion, to deny some thoughts, to repress it in a way. So even psychology, you were talking about Buddhism, and in my thesis, I was studying about mindfulness and everything, and there was something I found in a book that William James, the father of American psychology, will know him much better than I do, but he used to say in the early 1900s, I guess, that Buddhism would become the center of Occident, of the Western psychology in 30 years.
Mhm.
And actually
Wow.
it's happening now, or it's in the last 10 or 20 years, these new perspectives like have been happening. So I found that was very, very interesting.
Let's
Yeah,
let's
yeah,
let's talk about our thesis and my
yeah,
dissertation,
yeah, I
because
would like to
that will
know.
keep us back to flow, and a good transition from mindfulness to flow. So I'll tell you a
Exactly.
little bit about mine, and curious to learn more about yours. And And again, I want to frame this for the audience that's listening. Um, if you're an athlete, if you're a high performing
Mm-hmm.
professional, if you're a parent, whatever it might be, think as I share my research, I want to challenge you to realize how this could be helpful for you in your own life. And so this is what I studied. I studied
Mm-hmm.
essentially how flow states, so those moments where we get into the zone, where we're fully absorbed, fully engaged, lost in what we're doing. This is the athlete in the zone. This is the dancer dancing to perfection. This is the parent having a deep conversation with their child. How flow state, yes, is a state where we can feel and perform at our best. It boosts productivity, creativity, learning. We transcend a sense of self, so it's truly a peak experience. However, flow also comes with a much lesser known potential dark side. This is
Yeah.
the athlete going from a flow state in sport to feeling depressed in their life. This is the extreme athlete needing a bigger and bigger wave to surf, or a bigger, more dangerous wall to climb, or the motorcyclist needing to go faster and faster, more and more risk, more and more challenge, more and more flow to feel okay. See, flow is so powerful, it becomes addictive. And so what happens is that if we don't learn to manage flow effectively, it can lead to a loss of self-control. So I specifically looked at how mindfulness training could help us get the best out of flow state and protect against its potential dark side, where we lose awareness of ourselves and end up living a life, that's not aligned with our values. And
Wow.
you know a little bit about me, you can understand how
Wow,
that's
that
been so deep.
that is very interesting because I never studied flow so deeply, and I had never heard this term, the dark side of flow, which I saw was one of the topics of your research. And I didn't know it could be addictive and negative. I thought that I had a simple idea that it happens eventually. Yeah. For example, I don't see myself getting in a flow state like every day. I wish I could, but sometimes
Mhm.
I just feel like if I'm playing an instrument, or if I'm, doing something, we lose track of time and everything. But I never had this idea that this could be addictive or even negative. I mean, could you talk a little bit
Yeah,
more
so
about it?
yeah, here are some of the studies that I included all the research in the dark
Okay.
side of flow. And so think about video game addiction, right?
Yeah.
People playing video games all day, all night. It's because they're in flow, right? They're lost in flow. Think about, again, extreme athletes. Big wave surfers was one study. So these big wave surfers, they need, their life could be falling apart, their relationship, they're not, with their family, they could be injured and putting themselves at physical risk, but they need to surf the next biggest wave, right? If we think about self-control, that's probably not being most self-regulated if you're needing
Hmm.
that. So addiction in video games, addiction in high risk sports. Also, they did an interesting study with kayakers. And because, again, when you're in flow state, you are not aware of yourself, especially if you're a beginner, you can lose uh, awareness of how dangerous what you're doing is, right?
Hmm.
Like you're so lost in what you're doing, you feel so in control, so confident that you can put yourself at really big risk. So there's that potential dark side. They also did a study with people in the military, and they talked about in the act of combat, as you kill someone, you're in a flow state, right? When you're in war, you're all, and we'll talk about what gets us into flow in a second. But you're in flow when you're in combat. You have to be, or else you're at severe risk. So you're fully focused, you're in flow, and again, because you're not thinking about the your long-term values or
Hmm.
goals, some people have found that they come back home and they realize that they weren't who they wish they had been. And so there's that potential dark side. But I'll step all the way back to share really what got me into the dark side of flow was a very old book. It was called In the Zone: Transcendental Experiences in Sport by Michael Murphy. He's the
Mhm.
gentleman that created the Esalen Institute in Big Sur, California.
Wow,
And yeah,
famous
and he's
institutes. Yeah.
very, very famous. And he had a quote from an athlete that would just say, I get into the zone in sports, but then in my personal life, I'm a mess. Like they don't know how to live
Okay.
from these moments in sport and to have like a philosophy that can allow them to feel connected and integrated with that experience in their day-to-day life. And that's where I was like, oh, mindfulness can help here. Mindfulness, and I'll share why I was confident mindfulness was the solution. And it's very succinctly. Uh, I started with a quote by Plato that the first and greatest victory is to conquer oneself. And so I feel that in flow, and the research supports this, we conquer the self, we transcend the self because we get so lost in what we're doing. We get so absorbed. There's no space. We can go into the neuroscience. The frontal cortex quiets down. We're just engaged in what we're doing. Versus mindfulness, we learn to conquer the self not by losing awareness of the self, by getting lost in what we're doing, but to learn to create a little space between our
Hmm.
thoughts, between our ego, as I said earlier. And so that's where I feel that if we learn to effectively oscillate between being into flow, into mindfulness, then we can make sure that we're getting the benefits of flow, we're being productive, we're being fearless, we're learning, and yet we can still check ourselves to say, am I still moving towards what's most important and of value to me in my life?
Okay, I got it. Yeah, so it is all about balance. So I was related to I I have to confess one of my addictions I had for some time was playing chess online. It's a terrible addiction. I mean, it's not the worst of them, but uh I felt so bad after it because you start to play and you want to beat your opponent and there you have the time, you lose, you are in a game. So the gamification, when you are in a game you lose track of everything around you. And I noticed that when I had a challenge and I had some extra time, oh, let me play some chess, but it was supposed to be 1 hour and I would spend 3 4 hours, so I didn't think of flow, but yes, I was in a for sure. It is flow,
Yes.
but also it was avoidance, you know.
Mhm. Yes.
And
Exactly. Yes.
it was not only flow. It was also, I think, a way to discharge my anxiety. You know, in a
Oh
way, I
yeah.
felt,
Oh,
oh, I'm going to
sure.
beat him. I want to play another one. So it was like that, and I'm just thinking about it. There was a little stability, but we are back. And so what you are bringing about flow is that some people, yeah, they forgot the other part, the other aspect of their lives. For example, they play video games or they surf huge waves, but they forget about the other problems. And they also the rush, the adrenaline, and it's so high that it's really addictive. Yeah. So I think is that it?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, and it's
Okay.
amazing throughout the conversation. We started with avoidance and talked to
Yeah.
mindfulness and now flow, and now it's all kind of coming full circle here. Very interesting. It's been a beautiful conversation. And again, I thank you for sharing your story of chess. I think it's a
Uh-huh.
great example. And like you said, with flow, so let me just back up and share a little bit more about flow
Sure.
for people that might not be aware. So flow is the psychological term for being in the zone. They call it flow state. It's a state of consciousness. It's an altered state of consciousness. There's a very rich, evolving neuroscience to understand flow state, where we understand there's a boost in dopamine, a boost in norepinephrine, so you're more motivated, you're higher energy. There's also an increased release in what's known as anandamide. Anandamide is an endocannabinoid. It's considered the bliss molecule. So this is what is like that runner's high, right? So we feel this euphoria in flow. And then on the back end of flow, we experience a boost in serotonin and oxytocin. So we feel good, we feel connected. So again, it's really one of the most addictive psychological states to be in. And I can go more into the neuroscience. Just very simply, part of the reason why flow is so beneficial, but also potentially dangerous, is that areas of the frontal cortex, where our sense of self and the default mode network become downregulated. One of the terms is called transient hypofrontality, so temporary downregulation of the frontal cortex. And so to get into flow, there's very simple rules. So, steps we could take. And this research, I should mention, really started with a gentleman named Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. You could find him. He's got many, many books. Beautiful, deep, rich books. I would encourage starting with Flow, the Psychology of Optimal Experience by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. And he identified a number of what we could call flow triggers. The first is having a clear goal. So if you're an athlete going into practice, what is your clear goal? If you're a professional going to work, make sure it's very, very clear what you're working on.
Okay.
Immediate and relevant feedback. We need to know how we're doing so that we can not think about ourselves. So a good example is like driving a car. You know where you're going, and you get all the feedback of the friction of the road, the signs, the speedometer, everything's telling you how you're doing. So we get immediate and relevant feedback that keeps us focused, keeps us locked in. And then the third fundamental rule of flow, or flow trigger, is what's known as the challenge skill balance. This is the golden rule of flow, is that there's an optimal challenge skill balance, meaning if I'm going to have a conversation with Roberto right now, let's increase the stakes. Let's make it really important. Let's put some risk. Let's be vulnerable. Let's make it a high challenge, because I think I got a decent amount of skill in talking about flow or mindfulness. And if it was a very basic, not a big challenge, and I have high skill, I'm going to be bored. I'm going to be disengaged. And if I'm not very skilled in talking about flow and mindfulness, and you want to talk about really complex things, I'm going to be anxious. I'm going to be, I'm not going to be in the flow channel. And so those are some of the initial flow triggers. And I'll just simply add that we've done a lot of research to add a number of additional triggers, both for individual flow as well as team or group flow state, which is another super fascinating state, even more fascinating than individual flow. Some of the individual flow triggers additionally are big risk, right? Big risk, being embodied, being in our body, feeling as if our action and body are merging together, novelty. When things are new, we're paying attention. All the flow triggers, simply what they do is they drive our attention into the present moment. And before I let you jump on there, Roberto, I will just share a little bit about team flow, because I think that's something I don't want to miss. Yeah, so team flow in the psychological literature is also called interbrain synchrony or interpersonal synchrony. This is when our brain waves, our heart rate, our breathing sync up with other people. And when that happens, all these what's called pro-social behaviors emerge. We're more collaborative, we're more trusting, we're more understanding, we're more empathetic. We feel as if we know how other people are going to act. And there's very clear ways that we can, similarly to individual flow, trigger a group flow state. So whether you're a coach or an athlete, there's ways you can do this, whether you're a CEO or leader in the workplace, or even a parent. There's many specific or team flow state. And the last thing I'll share is why I say it's more interesting than individual flow, because flowing together is better than flowing on our own. It's a bigger
Mhm.
challenge right off the bat, so it's a deeper flow state when we experience team flow.
Wow, that's very interesting. But how, I'm curious, how do you measure that? How can I measure that a team flow is deeper or higher than an individual flow?
Yeah. Well, I'd say right off the bat that when you think of any kind of team assessment, team
Yeah.
chemistry, synchrony, those are all kind of pulling on facets of team flow. But if we want to get really specific, my friend Hoot from the net, he did his dissertation on team flow, and he has a company called Flow Concepts in the Netherlands, where it'd be a great interview for you.
Yeah.
He's kind of the leader in team flow state, and he's developed his own assessment process. And what team flow measures is a shared reason for being, so a shared goal, team goal, open communication, trust, a sense of holistic focus, awareness of what other people are working on within the team, open feedback, a few other characteristics that his research have found are the biggest predictors of team flow. I love this topic. Interpersonal synchrony is super fascinating. Yeah.
Fantastic. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Yes. And when we see in sports, when you see a team in flow, it's magical. Everything happens, everything is synchronized, and we just have this feeling, for sure is much more beautiful, let's say, because it's a group of people working together. But I would like you to if you could quickly repeat those three factors for an individual flow. I think
Yeah.
this is very important. So the first one, there was a little,
Oh, you
yeah,
cut out there. Yeah. So the three main triggers for flow state,
yeah,
first identified by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, is one, having a clear goal, knowing
there you go.
absolutely what are you working towards. Number
Mm-hmm,
two, ensuring that you have immediate and relevant feedback. You got to know how well you're doing. If you're
mm-hmm,
going to stay focused, you thinking and asking, how am I doing? You want to get all this feedback from other people, from teammates, from coaches, from technology, whatever it can be. So immediate relevant feedback. And then the third principle or trigger to flow, the golden rule, is a balance between your skill level and the challenges that you take on.
mm-hmm.
And you really want that challenge to be slightly beyond your skill level so that it requires all of your attention. You get fully engaged in what you're doing.
Yeah, it makes total sense. Yes. If it's not challenging, it's not cool. But you need to have that exact or that appropriate level of challenge. Wow, this is it's so simple, but sometimes we can and this uh, and this is so important for every area. If you think in sports or corporates, and also to use those strategies for team flow with teams. It's simple, but it changes everything. It changes the way you
Mhm.
organize your life, in a way, your day, and how things work. Yeah. Wow, that's awesome.
Absolutely. And even within therapy and
Hmm.
I know obviously most psychologists here, um, I like to think about the flow mindset as a mindset becoming anti-fragile. So growing through challenges, right? So if we think that flow is this challenge skill balance, anti-fragility is this concept where through hard challenges, we don't just sustain and come out the same. We actually get better from them. We grow through them, or we can call it post-traumatic growth in some instances. And so I believe that flow state and it's really a path to growth. You need to consistently take on challenges, develop new skills, take on new challenges, develop new skills. And so it's really a path to become anti-fragile, to become resilient and sustain your performance and well-being over the long term. So
Wow.
plenty of
It's like a
applications.
ladder. You are climbing or walking up a ladder. Yes. Wow, that's so
Yes.
interesting. Oh, Brent, unfortunately, we have 5 minutes. We are a little short on time, and I could spend like at least 1 hour more here with you. I think there's so much you could talk about, but eh, we are speaking of flow, and I'm going to make a question related to your practice nowadays. What are you doing professionally that makes you feel what do you do
Mhm.
that makes you feel in a state of flow? I don't know in which area you are investing your energy more. If you could share with us to the public to know, and where how can they could look for you as well.
Yeah, you bet. Thank you, Roberto, and thank you for anyone that's listened through to the end of the podcast. So appreciate any feedback you can share on the podcast. Reaching out to me or Roberto would be super fun. And yeah, I'll tell you a little bit about how to contact me and yeah, what puts me into flow now. Uh, so really, where I'm focused now, Roberto, is completing really robust psychological assessments with clients. Many for ADHD diagnosis, but also for other areas. With each of my clients now, I like to do a deep assessment to really deeply understand them. So the craft, the craft of taking the scales, measuring their scores, deeply writing a thorough report and treatment coaching plan. It's like you're an adventurer, right? Into someone's mind and into their history. And so I love getting to know clients deeply and writing really robust, thorough assessment reports. That's really a newer thing I'm getting back to doing that I get a lot of flow in. I get a ton of flow. Uh, Certainly coaching individual clients. And what I'll add is that my coaching now is so simple, Roberto. Like a lot of people go to counseling or coaching, and oftentimes, and I'm guilty of this, coaches or psychologists can make the path of growth way too complicated, not doable. My work now is who are you at your best? Now let's build tiny little habits. I'm talking about the first 5 seconds when you wake up. Let's take a deep breath. Let's think one good thought. Let's set your intention for the day. 5 seconds. That's all it takes. And then let's do an evening practice. Then let's start. I'm loving finding a lot of flow, so coaching executives, mostly some athletes, in how to make the path to self-actualization doable and really stacking wins at doing that. I get a ton of flow as a keynote speaker. I was in Vegas a couple months ago talking about flow state and anti-fragility in the workplace. So big challenge, a few hundred people speaking in front of a crowd, super fun. I definitely am at my best in those moments. Similar, I feel the same now than when I felt in that keynotes, because I'm not thinking about myself. And just like everybody else, when I think about myself, oftentimes it's a distraction. It's not helpful. I don't feel my best when I'm self-conscious. So this is a huge gift and definitely puts me into flow. And then lastly, Roberto, and I'm so happy I'm remembering to say this, I became a father 7 months ago, and I
Wow.
have a beautiful baby boy, Wesley, and he's taught me the most important lesson in my life, and that is the value of self-compassion. So, Roberto, as I have my son and I soothe my son, tell him I love him, support him, rock back and forth, I've been soothing myself. Yeah, I've been
Mhm.
calming myself, putting myself into rest and digest mode. And throughout my life, and this is really important, I want your listeners to hear this. Throughout my life, whether it's in sport or business or academics, I often used self-criticism and fight or flight to get motivated, to put me into action, to get into flow. Whereas we know that self-compassion, being kind, wanting the best for ourselves, understanding that we're not alone in our challenges, that is the path to sustained motivation. It actually increases our standards. It actually increases decision making and our problem solving, and it helps mitigate so much of the self-sabotage that ends up with self-criticism. And if we don't learn to be kind to ourselves, we can achieve everything in life, but we'll still just arrive at more self-criticism, right? Nothing can learn to soothe us and calm us like just being kind and compassionate to ourselves. And so that's probably the most important thing that I keep working on to get into more flow and keep nurturing. And it's an everyday process, because I'm very good at being critical of myself.
Wow, that's great. That's a great way to finish this podcast. Congratulations on your son, and I'm sure it must be an amazing experience and life-changing experience. And I think it's very beautiful to finish with this self-compassion message, especially if athletes, for the athletes who are listening to us, and we know how things work and the amount of pressure we all go through. Um, well, Dr. Brent, thank you very much. Let's see, maybe we can arrange another talk. I know that there's so much I also would like to talk to. I'd like to know your story with the Iron Man, and also, there's so much things you could talk about. And but it was amazing. It was a great conversation, and I wish you a great day. I know it's morning there in Canada. It's already 6 o'clock, almost here in Portugal. PM.
Wonderful. Well, Dr. Roberto, it's been a huge pleasure. If anyone wants to follow up with me, you can just go to my website, brenthogarth.com. Follow me on Instagram, Brent Hogarth. LinkedIn is probably where I'm most active. Feel free to message me or just email me at brenthogarth@gmail. Or even schedule a free intake call with me on my website. Love to connect with any listeners here. And Roberto, it's been a huge pleasure. It's such a gift to get to know you. And I think some really cool things here moving forward. God knows I want to come back out to Portugal and Brazil. So let's stay connected, and thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay.
Wow.